I was a danger for American womanhood. I was such a corruption for everybody. I know my voice was taken off.
She was Hollywood's idea of a perfect woman, natural, luminous, untouchable. America had put her on a pedestal so high that when she fell, the entire country heard it. A single letter changed the course of her life forever, and what followed was a scandal so enormous that a sitting United States senator took to the floor of Congress to destroy her. This is Ingrid Bergman, the Roberto Rossellini affair that forced her into exile. The saint they built. Before there was a scandal, there was a myth. And before the myth, there was a girl in Stockholm who had already lost everything that mattered. Ingrid Bergman was born on August 29, 1915, in Stockholm, Sweden. She lost her mother when she was just 3 years old. Her father, Justus Bergman, was a photographer and an artist of sorts, a man who loved beautiful things and who saw something extraordinary in his daughter. He raised her on his own, took her portrait constantly, and filled her childhood with the kind of warmth that makes absence even harder to bear. He was also, by accounts from those who knew the family, deeply attuned to Ingrid's inner life in a way that shaped how she understood the relationship between image and reality, between the person in the photograph and the person holding still for it. When Ingrid was 12, her father died too. She went to live with relatives. She cycled through different households, each temporary, each a reminder that the permanence she had known was gone. She was shy, tall for her age, and absorbed entirely in the idea of becoming an actress. At 17, she auditioned for the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm, got in, and then left after just 1 year when she decided that film was where she needed to be. The move was bold, and it turned out correct. Swedish director Gustaf Melander recognized what she could do and began casting her in increasingly significant roles. By the mid-1930s, she was one of Sweden's most recognized young actresses, physically distinctive, emotionally precise, and possessed of a quality on film that her Swedish audiences recognized even if they struggled to name it. The film that changed everything was Intermezzo, made in 1936. She played a pianist who falls in love with a famous married violinist, a woman who disrupts an existing life for a passionate one, and then faces the consequences. The character ultimately gives up the man, steps back, lets him return to his wife and family. It was presented as the noble outcome. There was something deeply ironic, in retrospect, about that particular story being the one that launched Bergman internationally. A tale about a woman who has an affair and then retreats into propriety, which was almost the precise opposite of what Bergman herself would eventually choose. But in 1936, nobody was reading omens. Petter Lindström was a doctor Bergman had married in June 1937, when she was 21 years old. He was several years older, educated, established, and by multiple accounts, a man who had a very clear sense of how things should be organized, including his wife's career. Their daughter, Pia, was born in September 1938. When Bergman went to America for the first time in 1939, she went alone. Lindström and Pia stayed in Sweden. That separation, the first of many, each longer than the last, was the shape of the marriage for the decade that followed. Not a partnership so much as a negotiation conducted across an ocean. American producer David O. Selznick bought the rights to remake Intermezzo and invited Bergman to reprise her role in the English-language version. She was 23 years old. She did not speak English. She had never been to America. And she said yes. Intermezzo, a love story, opened in September 1939, and the response was immediate. Selznick called her the Palmolive Garbo. A San Francisco paper compared her to a fresh Swedish snowball. American audiences, accustomed to the elaborate artifice of Hollywood glamour, the heavy makeup, the sculpted hair, the practiced poses, had never quite seen anyone like her. She wore almost no makeup. She was 5 feet 9 inches tall and unself-conscious about it. She arrived at the studio early and left late and asked to have her dressing room equipped so she could live there during a production. Selznick himself noted in a letter to his publicity director that he had never worked with an actress so completely devoted to her work. She never suggested leaving at 6 o'clock, never complained about her accommodations, and seemed to think of absolutely nothing except the film she was making. She seemed, in short, to be made of completely different material than everyone around her. Selznick signed her to a longer contract, and the decade that followed was one of the most luminous in Hollywood history. She appeared in Adam Had Four Sons and Rage in Heaven in 1941, both of which cast her as wholesome and virtuous in ways that hardened the public's perception of who she was. She insisted on switching roles in the 1941 production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, trading the good girl part for the barmaid, which told you something about how much she pushed against the image that was being built around her, even then. But the roles she is remembered for from that decade were the ones that matched what audiences had already decided she was. She played in Casablanca in 1942, opposite Humphrey Bogart, in a role that she herself did not particularly love, but that the rest of the world held on to like a lifeline. She later said that she and Bogart were simply two professionals doing their jobs, that the electricity between them was craft, not chemistry. She kissed him, she once said, but she never really knew him. None of that mattered to audiences, who saw what they wanted to see and made the film an enduring monument. She won her first Academy Award for Best Actress for Gaslight in 1944, playing a woman being systematically manipulated by a cruel husband, a performance of inward suffering delivered with total control. She made Spellbound and Notorious with Alfred Hitchcock in 1945 and 1946, the latter widely regarded as one of the finest performances of her career. She played an alcoholic noblewoman in Under Capricorn in 1949, and she was nominated for various additional awards throughout the decade. The press called her a saint. Audiences went further. They called her something close to pure. The problem with a pedestal is what happens when the person on it turns out to be human. And Ingrid Bergman was very human, bored, restless, emotionally hungry, in ways that her marriage to Petter Lindström had long since stopped addressing. Lindström was described by those who knew them as serious, controlling, and entirely focused on his own professional ascent. He had moved from dentistry into neurosurgery, and the trajectory of his ambition took up most of the available space in their household. He managed much of Bergman's business affairs with a grip that she resented increasingly as her career grew, making decisions about her contracts, her money, and her professional life in ways that she found diminishing rather than supportive. The geography of the marriage was also strained by the nature of her career. She had gone to America alone initially, leaving Pia with Lindström in Sweden, and the separations that followed were long, repeated, and clearly not sustainable. One biographer noted that Lindström, when asked later why he hadn't left the marriage himself, given everything that was happening, replied with blunt candor that he had stayed for financial reasons. That single answer said quite a lot about the state of things. Not a marriage held together by love, or even by shared ambition, but by practical calculation on at least one side. Bergman, for her part, had been increasingly open to the people who knew her about the gap between the life she was living and the life she was longing for. What Bergman was longing for, in her own words, was something real, something that felt genuinely alive, that demanded something of her beyond proficiency and photogenia. She had made enough glossy Hollywood productions to know that a different kind of cinema existed, one that was less manufactured, less comfortable, and far more honest. She had seen two films by an Italian director that had convinced her of this completely. His name was Roberto Rossellini. The letter that started everything. Roberto Rossellini was not a man who fit any of the categories Hollywood operated in. He was Italian, charismatic, in an unconventional way, and the director behind two films that had shaken European cinema to its foundation: Rome, Open City in 1945, and Pesar in 1946. Both were made in the rubble of post-war Italy, with non-professional actors, handheld cameras, and a rawness that no studio system could have produced or would have allowed. They looked and felt unlike anything coming out of Hollywood. Bergman saw them in the United States and was stunned. She described watching Rossellini's films as a kind of revelation, the sense of encountering a way of working that she had been searching for without quite knowing what she was looking for. She was also, by this point, deeply dissatisfied with the kind of work she was being offered. The roles were profitable, and the praise was consistent. But she wanted to be challenged in a way that the Hollywood machine simply wasn't interested in providing. She felt, in her own telling, like a bird of passage, constantly restless, unable to settle, winning awards and buying houses, and still experiencing what she called a daily sadness she couldn't explain. In early 1949, she did something that was either brave or reckless, depending on how you look at it. She wrote Rossellini a letter. The letter was simple and direct. She told him she had seen his films and admired them enormously, that she could offer him her name and her talent, and that she spoke English, some French, and a little German, but not a word of Italian. She said that if he had any use for her, she was ready to come to Italy. Rossellini wrote back. He proposed a film set on the volcanic island of Stromboli, off the coast of Sicily, a remote, difficult location where the volcano itself was still active, where the villagers were largely elderly, and where the landscape was as bleak and otherworldly as anything Bergman had ever appeared against. The film would follow a displaced European woman who marries an Italian fisherman to escape a refugee camp and finds herself stranded on an island that feels like the end of the world. There was nothing comfortable about any of it, which was precisely why Bergman agreed. She travelled to Rome in the spring of 1949. Filming on Stromboli began on the island itself, and somewhere in the combination of the location, the work, and the man directing her, something shifted. Rossellini was 42 at the time. He was separated from his wife, Marcella de Marchis, and was known throughout the Italian film world for his relationships with actresses. He had been involved for years with the Italian star Anna Magnani, a relationship so turbulent that when it ended, Magnani made her own film set on one of the Aeolian Islands, reportedly in direct response to how the relationship with Rossellini had gone. People who knew him described a man of enormous energy, enormous confidence, and an almost total indifference to conventional rules about how a person should behave. He was the opposite of Petter Lindström in almost every way that mattered to Bergman at that particular moment. There is a photograph from the Stromboli shoot that became one of the most reproduced images of the affair. Rossellini and Bergman are reading a script together in the Italian sun, leaning toward each other in the easy, unguarded way of people who have forgotten they might be watched. The photograph appeared in a May 1949 issue of Life magazine, alongside the headline, Strombolian Idol. The headline was not entirely ironic. The photograph was not ambiguous about what it was showing. By May 1949, the European press had picked up the story, and the rumor of what was happening between them had been circulating among Hollywood's networks for weeks. The Motion Picture Association of America reportedly sent a message to Bergman warning her that her behavior was going to destroy her career. Studio representatives sent word that if she did not return home immediately, the professional consequences would be severe. Her husband was still in America. Her daughter Pia was 10 years old and still in America. And Bergman stayed in Italy. On August 5th, 1949, her publicist issued a statement in her name acknowledging that she was seeking a divorce from Lindström. The language was careful. She described persistent gossip that had reached the point of misrepresenting her, and said she was retiring into private life. But the admission was out, and there was no pulling it back. By December 1949, the American gossip columnist Luella Parsons had published a report that Bergman was pregnant with Rossellini's child. That was when everything broke open. The Senate, the scandal, and the woman they called evil. The American public in 1950 had very little patience for nuance on the subject of adultery, and essentially none at all for a woman they had spent a decade worshipping as a model of purity and grace. The outrage was not merely social, it was personal, in the way that outrage only gets when people have invested their own projections into someone else's image and feel personally betrayed by the discovery that the image was not the person. The mail that came in for Bergman during those months was, by any description, extraordinary in its hostility. One journalist who was given access to her mailbags during the scandal later described bag after bag of furious letters, 10, 12, 14 enormous mailbags full of condemnation from across the country. Fan clubs disbanded. Church groups organized boycotts. Newspapers that had spent years praising her now ran editorials demanding accountability. School organizations issued formal denunciations. The motion picture industry was calling for her films to be withdrawn. It was, by every measure, a full moral panic, and it was directed at a woman who was, by this point, living in Italy, pregnant, separated from her daughter, and watching her professional life in America disintegrate in real time. Then the politicians got involved. On March 14th, 1950, Senator Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado, a Democrat and former governor of his state, took the floor of the United States Senate. What followed was one of the more remarkable speeches in the history of American political theater. Johnson called Bergman one of the most powerful women on earth and a powerful influence for evil. He went further, calling her a horrible example of womanhood, a free love cultist, and a common mistress. He described Rossellini as a love pirate and a home wrecker. He called their film Stromboli, a stupid film about a pregnant woman and a volcano that had exploited America. He also, in the same breath, condemned actress Rita Hayworth, who was engaged in her own public extramarital affair at the time, branding both women apostles of degradation. He proposed federal legislation that would license actors, actresses, directors, and producers, and strip those licenses from anyone found guilty of moral turpitude or lewdness. He demanded that Bergman be declared permanently unwelcome in the United States and barred from ever returning on grounds of moral turpitude. A writer covering the scandal noted the particular cruelty of the timing. The woman who had played Joan of Arc, and had been celebrated for it, was now being burned at the stake. The comparison was not lost on Johnson either, who seemed entirely comfortable with the metaphor. The Senate did not pass Johnson's proposed licensing legislation, but the speech entered the congressional record, the denunciation was official, and the message to Bergman and to Hollywood was unmistakable. She was not welcome here, and anyone who helped her work here was taking a risk. Stromboli had opened in American theaters in February 1950. In the same month, Bergman gave birth to her son. Renato Roberto Ranaldo Giusto Giuseppe Rossellini, called Robin, born on February 2nd in a clinic in Rome. RKO, which distributed the film, lost approximately $200,000 on it. In Italy, the film won the Rome Prize for Cinema as the best film of the year. In the United States, it was a commercial disaster, and the reviews were vicious, their sourness impossible to fully separate from the personal feelings critics and audiences had about the woman in it. The New York Times review opened by calling the film incredibly feeble, inarticulate, uninspiring, and painfully banal, language that went well beyond the work on screen. A week after her son was born, Bergman filed for divorce from Lindström under Mexican jurisdiction. She married Rossellini by proxy on May 24, 1950, though she would not secure a formal American divorce from Lindström until November of that year. The custody arrangement that emerged from the proceedings gave Lindström primary custody of Pia. Bergman, who had chosen to remain in Italy and had no practical means of fighting a custody battle from abroad against a man with far greater legal standing on American soil, lost her daughter. Pia Lindström was 11 years old. Bergman would not see her again for 7 years. That detail, the 7 years, tends to get lost in the larger narrative of the scandal. The headline was the affair, the pregnancy, the Senate speech. But underneath all of it was a mother who had made a choice that separated her from her child for most of a decade. Whatever Bergman felt about the choice she had made and the life she had chosen, the cost of it was real, and it was paid by both of them. She knew she could not go back to America. She stayed in Italy. The years in exile. The years that followed were not what either Bergman or Rossellini had imagined. The romantic fire that had driven everything, the letter, the film, the pregnancy, the marriage, the scandal, collided almost immediately with the practical reality of who they were to each other when the emergency was over and daily life set in. Rossellini was a man of great vision and almost no interest in the domestic world. He spent money freely and without apparent concern for whether they actually had it. He was possessive about Bergman in ways that extended into her professional life, insisting that she work only with him, refusing to let her take roles from other directors, creating a situation in which the most famous actress in the world was essentially idle while her reputation in her primary market was still in free fall. Without work, Bergman grew bored and listless. She had spent her entire adult life defined by her craft, by the discipline and focus that a professional actor brings to every day, and she now had nowhere to put any of it. When she did drink, more than she had before, people around her understood what it was about. Rossellini was also unfaithful, which, considering the circumstances of their union, was either darkly ironic or simply consistent with the kind of man he was. He had pursued his leading women before Bergman, and he would do so again. The pattern had been visible long before she wrote him that letter. She had simply believed, as people tend to do, that the pattern would be different with her. They made 5 more films together after Stromboli: Europa 51, We the Women, Journey to Italy, Joan of Arc at the Stake, and Fear, between 1952 and 1955. None of them performed commercially in the way they needed to. Rossellini's neo-realist sensibility was at fundamental odds with Bergman's star power. Audiences who came for Bergman found something that looked and felt nothing like her Hollywood work, stripped down, unglamorous, emotionally demanding in ways that mainstream American cinema did not ask of its viewers. The films were admired by serious critics in Europe, particularly Journey to Italy, which decades later would be recognized as a foundational work of European art cinema. But in the immediate term, they generated almost no money, and the mounting financial pressure on the household made everything else worse. On June 18, 1952, Bergman gave birth to twin daughters, Isotta Ingrid Rossellini and Isabella Rossellini. Isabella would go on to become one of the most recognizable models and actresses of her generation, inheriting something from both parents that was genuinely difficult to name and impossible to manufacture. The twins were born into a household that was, by this point, already showing the cracks that would eventually split it apart entirely. 3 children, mounting debt, a career in stasis, a husband who controlled what roles she was allowed to consider, and who was meanwhile finding his attention drawn elsewhere. Back in America, the campaign against her had not abated. Ed Sullivan, who hosted one of the most watched variety programs on American television, ran a poll on his show asking his audience directly whether Bergman should be allowed back into the United States. The fact that this was considered an appropriate question for a television entertainment program says something about the temperature of the era. She was, in the language of the government, persona non grata, an unwelcome foreign national, though she had committed no crime that any law actually defined. Fan magazines condemned her. Church groups boycotted her films. School organizations issued formal denunciations. What she had done was humiliate the image that America had built around her. And in 1950, America had not yet forgiven that. She did not apologize. That, in itself, was remarkable. When a journalist asked her at a later press conference whether she had any regrets about the path she had chosen, she laughed and said she had none. That she regretted only the things she had not done, not the things she had. She had done what she felt like. That kind of composure in the face of that level of public condemnation was either extraordinary psychological strength or the result of a woman who had already lost enough that losing more had stopped frightening her. In Italy, she was not a scandal. She was a movie star who had made a choice for love and was living with it. That difference in perception mattered to her, and she held on to it. But the marriage to Rossellini was deteriorating. The money problems worsened. The professional stagnation deepened. And by the mid-1950s, Rossellini had done to Bergman what he had done to Anna Magnani before her. He had fallen for someone new. The woman was a Bengali screenwriter named Sonali Dasgupta. By 1957, Rossellini had left Bergman for her. The symmetry was not lost on anyone who had followed the story from the beginning. The man who had been the instrument of Bergman's most catastrophic fall from grace had now, on his own terms, repeated the pattern entirely. Bergman and Rossellini divorced in 1957 after 7 years of marriage and a decade of shared professional and personal turbulence. She walked away from it with 3 children, a decimated career in the country where she had built her stardom, and the clarity that sometimes comes from having very little left to lose. Which is precisely when the studio called. Anastasia and the Return of the Queen. It was Daryl Zanuck, the production chief at 20th Century Fox, who decided that the moment had arrived to bring Bergman back. Not to America, not yet, but to the screen. His executives were skeptical. The reading they had on American public opinion was that the wound was still too raw, that Bergman remained too radioactive, that putting her in a major Hollywood-backed production was a commercial risk that the numbers didn't support. Zanuck overruled them. He had seen something shift in the culture, some small but measurable softening in how Bergman was being discussed, and he trusted his instinct. The film was Anastasia, released in 1956. It told the story of a woman in 1920s Paris who might or might not be the surviving daughter of the last Russian Tsar, a woman whose identity has been destroyed, who is brought in from exile by a prince who believes she can be used to claim the Romanov fortune, and who must prove to a skeptical, powerful world that she is who she claims to be. The casting of Ingrid Bergman in that particular role was not accidental, and the people who made the film understood exactly what they were doing. Her co-star was Yul Brynner. The parallels between Bergman's own story and that of the character she was playing were too obvious to miss, and nobody missed them. A woman returning from exile. A woman whose identity had been publicly questioned and publicly punished. A woman asking to be seen again. The film was shot entirely in Europe. Bergman did not come to America for it. Before it opened, Ed Sullivan, the same man who had polled his audience about whether she deserved to come back at all, flew to London to interview her for his television show. The interview was warm. Sullivan, whatever his earlier posturing, was entirely won over. His show was among the most widely watched in America, and his endorsement, implicit rather than stated, did more to shift public opinion than any studio press campaign could have managed. Anastasia opened to strong reviews and strong box office returns. The American public, which had spent 6 years being told that Bergman was a figure of degradation, went to the cinema and watched her disappear into a complex, vulnerable, ultimately triumphant performance, and the cognitive dissonance of the experience seems to have broken something loose. A woman that awful couldn't do something that good. Either the performance was the truth of her, or the scandal had been a collective overreaction. The audience, gradually and then quite suddenly, chose the former. At the Academy Awards ceremony in March 1957, Ingrid Bergman won the Oscar for Best Actress. She was not there to receive it. She was still keeping her distance from America, still uncertain of her welcome, still navigating the emotional geography of a country that had publicly humiliated her 7 years earlier. Her co-star, Cary Grant, accepted the award on her behalf. Grant had been one of Bergman's closest friends since her early Hollywood years, and his appearance on that stage, accepting that statue for an absent woman who had been declared persona non grata by the federal government, was its own kind of statement about where things actually stood among the people who knew her. When the news reached her, she described the moment as one of the most extraordinary of her life. It was also the beginning of the end of the Exile. In 1957, the same year the divorce from Rossellini was finalized, she returned to New York to accept the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Anastasia in person. She described her own nervousness about it openly in later interviews, saying that she knew it was a moment of genuine reckoning, that arriving in America alone and presenting herself to the press and public was a different kind of courage than any role had ever asked of her. She could prepare for a performance. She could not fully prepare for what it would feel like to walk into a room of people who had, not long ago, wanted her gone forever. She walked in. She smiled. She said she had no regrets. She said she regretted only what she hadn't done. America, cautiously and then warmly, let her back in. In 1958, at the Academy Awards ceremony, Bergman appeared on stage as a presenter. It was her first major public appearance in the United States since the scandal. The audience gave her a standing ovation before she had said a single word. She married Lars Schmidt, a Swedish theatrical producer, in 1958. It was her third marriage, and the quietest of the three. They were together until 1975, when they too divorced. The relationship another casualty of her fundamental restlessness, her commitment to her work, the difficulty of building a shared life with someone whose attention was always at least partly somewhere else. She reunited with Pia in 1957, the year the divorce from Rossellini came through. They had not been in the same room for 7 years. Whatever happened in that reunion was kept private, which was perhaps appropriate. Some things are not for an audience. What the exile cost and what it left behind. In 1972, 22 years after Senator Edwin Johnson had stood on the floor of the United States Senate and called Ingrid Bergman a powerful influence for evil, a different senator stood in the same chamber and read a formal apology into the congressional record. Senator Charles Percy of Illinois acknowledged that the attack on Bergman had been wrong and that the record should reflect it. Bergman received a copy of the apology in New York. She wrote back to Percy acknowledging it, saying that her war with America had been over for a long time, but that the wounds had remained. His gesture, she said, had healed them forever. It was a gracious response to a gesture that came 2 decades too late. But it was also, in its way, a recognition of something important, that what had been done to her in 1950 was worth acknowledging in the official language of the institution that had done it. She continued working through the 1970s with a consistency that no scandal had been able to permanently interrupt. She won her 3rd Academy Award, for Best Supporting Actress this time, for Murder on the Orient Express in 1974, playing one of the most disagreeable characters in the film with a precision that made the room laugh and wince in equal measure. She was nominated again for Autumn Sonata in 1978, directed by the Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman. No family relation, but one of the most emotionally exacting directors she had ever worked with. The film required her to play a world-famous concert pianist who has catastrophically failed her daughter as a mother. The performance was, by most accounts, among the finest of her career. She did not win. The nomination itself, her 7th, was testament enough to what she could still do. Her final role was Golda Meir in a television miniseries called A Woman Called Golda, filmed in 1982 while she was already seriously ill with breast cancer. She accepted the role knowing what condition she was in. She showed up, as she had always shown up, early, prepared, giving everything the work required of her. The Emmy Award she won for the performance was accepted posthumously by her daughter Pia. She died on August 29, 1982, her 67th birthday, at her home in London, surrounded by people who had loved her through every version of herself. Her daughter Isabella became a model and actress of international renown. Her daughter Pia became a television journalist in New York. Her son Robin became a documentary filmmaker. All 4 of her children, 3 from Rossellini, 1 from Lindström, survived her. The story of Ingrid Bergman's Exile is sometimes told as a story about morality, about the limits of what a particular era would tolerate from a woman who was famous. That reading is accurate as far as it goes. What it misses is the more interesting thing, which is what Bergman herself seemed to understand about the whole business. She had been constructed by an industry and a public into an image of purity that she had never claimed for herself, and that had nothing to do with who she actually was. When she dismantled that image, not through any public statement or deliberate act, but simply through the ordinary pursuit of her own life and desires, the machine that had built the image turned on her with extraordinary force. She had gone from saint to, in her own words, whore, and then back to saint again, all within a single lifetime. She said she couldn't understand why people thought she was pure and full of nobleness. She was simply herself. The world's feelings about that were, in the end, the world's problem. She was ranked 4th on the American Film Institute's list of the greatest female screen legends, below only Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, and Audrey Hepburn. She won 3 Academy Awards, 2 Emmy Awards, and a Tony. She made 50 films across 4 languages. She worked until the month she died. The letter she wrote to Roberto Rossellini in 1949 changed everything. It cost her 7 years in exile, custody of her daughter for the same length of time, the carefully constructed image that an industry had spent a decade building around her. and the early part of 3 children's lives. What she got in return was a life that was actually hers, complicated, flawed, publicly dissected, and entirely unashamed. She said she had no regrets. Given everything she had been through, that took either extraordinary courage or extraordinary honesty. Most likely it took both. And the thing about Ingrid Bergman, the thing that makes her story feel relevant long after the cultural moment that produced the scandal has dissolved into history, is that the work outlasted everything. The image they built around her didn't survive the scandal. The scandal didn't survive her return. What survived, through all of it, was the 50 films, the performances, the particular quality of presence that Selznick had recognized when she was 23 and unknown and couldn't speak the language, and still somehow made everyone in the room feel that something important was happening. That survived entirely intact. It always does. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.